Good evening, and welcome to our live webcast of Open Book, Open Mind Online with Tom Perrotta talking about his latest novel, Tracy Flick Can't Win. I'm Ariel Zeitlin, one of the librarians at Montclair Public Library. And first, I'd just like to draw your attention to the Q&A button. If you're using a computer or a smartphone, it's at the bottom of your screen. If you're using a tablet, it's at the top of your screen. That's how you can send us your questions for the Q&A, and it's also how you can ask for live tech help from my librarian co-host, Roger Cosson, at any time during the webcast. Now, I'd like to introduce Gina Chung Fort, a member of the board of the Montclair Library Foundation. Welcome, Gina.
Thank you, Ariel. We're so happy you're here for another virtual webcast of Open Book, Open Mind. I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Montclair Public Library Foundation. We are a group of your friends and neighbors, and our mission is to raise money to fund the offerings that make our library so special. This includes library programs like this one, staff development, access to digital resources, and other needs that aren't covered by city funding. Your donations support initiatives like laptop lending, Wi-Fi hotspots for Montclair residents without internet access, lifelong learning classes, homework tutoring and resume help, children's literacy programs, and significant growth in the ebook and audiobook collections during the pandemic. So, after you enjoy this event, please make a donation through our website, montclairplf.org. Gifts of all sizes have an impact, and the library needs your support now more than ever. Thank you very much, and please enjoy the program.
Thank you so much for all that you do, Gina. And if anyone in the audience wants to contribute to the library in other ways, please search for Friends of the Montclair Library on our website or on Facebook. There's also a link to donate to the library in the chat. And now I am delighted to introduce our guest of honor tonight, Tom Perrotta. Tom is the best-selling author of 9 works of fiction, including Election and Little Children, both of which were made into Oscar-nominated films, and The Leftovers, which was adapted into a critically acclaimed Peabody Award-winning HBO series. His work has been translated into a multitude of languages. Perrotta grew up in the Garden State and lives near Boston. Welcome, Tom.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's such a pleasure.
We're really glad you're here. Tracy Flick Can't Win is the long-awaited sequel to the much-loved bestseller Election, which was also made into a classic film starring Reese Witherspoon in the iconic role. This time, Tracy is still determined to take high school politics by storm, this time as candidate for principal. The book just came out last week and has already received a ton of buzz. As Publishers Weekly put it, this is the rare sequel that lives up to the original. And the New York Times called the book exquisitely drawn. Few novelists are better than Perrotta at conveying the full spectrum of human delusion. We have links in the chat for you to borrow or buy the book. Now, I'm also very happy to introduce Tom's conversation partner, Elisabeth Egan. Liz is an editor at the New York Times Book Review, the author of her own very well-received novel, A Window Opens, and a member of the Open Book, Open Mind Advisory Committee. Welcome back, Liz.
Thanks, Ariel. I'm so happy to be here. And Tom, welcome. We're thrilled to have you.
Oh, well, it's so nice to be talking to you, Liz. I'm really happy to do it.
This is a real honor.
Goes both ways.
I just want to say before I sign off and come back after the conversation that to everybody at home, that you can already start submitting your questions while the conversation is going on. And this is the moment we've all been waiting for. Thank you.
Thanks, Ariel. Tom, I'm starting with the most important question, which I will ask, even though unfortunately we are not sitting across from each other in the library here in Montclair. Is this your first New Jersey event related to Tracy Flick?
Yes, it is. It is my
Well,
first. Thank you. It's my first and only New Jersey event. And I went to the Montclair Book Festival a few years ago and talked to Patrick Wilson and Dagmara Domenchek, his wife. And that was a lot of fun. And so Montclair's become a kind of a, my literary stop in New Jersey. And it's actually pretty close to where I grew up in Garwood. And I'm just really sorry. Oh,
what is Garwood?
136 on the Parkway.
Okay, we're 151.
Yeah, so not far.
Okay, good. And what is your relationship with the Garden State? Are you somebody like me who takes great pride in being from here, or are you like my sister who has reinvented herself as a Mainer?
Well, I've been living in Massachusetts for about 25 years, but I'm definitely of the opinion that you are where you came from. I haven't reinvented myself in that sense. I live elsewhere. I come back a lot. My mom is still living in the house I grew up in, and she's 90 now. So I come down once a month and spend some time with her. So I still have, pretty close ties to Garwood. And that's the house I grew up in. So
that's amazing. Well, welcome back. We're honored to have you. And I was wondering if you could begin maybe by telling us, let me back up a little bit. This is a difficult question. How would you describe Tracy Flick Can't Win to somebody who hasn't read it yet, which obviously I have, but for anybody who's watching or listening who hasn't had a chance to dive in yet, how would you describe it?
Yes, that's a great question, because I think it raises the question of what is a sequel. Because I would say Tracy Flick Can't Win is actually a companion book to Election. You could read either one first, but it helps if you know who Tracy Flick is. Tracy Flick was a candidate for student body president in the novel Election that I wrote in the 1990s, and that book was made into a wonderful movie directed by Alexander Payne, and it introduced the world to this young actor named Reese Witherspoon, who inhabited Tracy with, a shocking ferocity. And as a result, Tracy became a kind of iconic figure who became like a cultural shorthand for a really ambitious, hard-driving young woman. And I think, people thought like Tracy's going to conquer the world. She is smart. She is hardworking. She has this intense ambition. And part of what led me to write Tracy Flick Can't Win was to think about where she might be now, some 25 years later. So it's a book about, I would say, this very hard driving, ambitious woman who has not managed to achieve the dreams that animated her youth. And now she's in middle age and trying to make peace with that, but also still trying to get doggedly ahead in the world. And that world that she's trying to succeed in is the same one as before. It's high school. It's just now she's an assistant principal, not a star student who's trying to be elected school president.
I should also add, because you modestly have not mentioned this, but the book is very funny. It has a certain poignancy and a sort of, there is that sort of pathos of all of life essentially being a version of high school, but there's also so much humor, and there are so many great observations about early middle age and parenthood and loyalty, both to one's job and one's spouse, or lack of loyalty in some cases. Actually, I wanted to see if you had a specific town in mind as you were writing the town of Green Meadow, where Tracy is the assistant principal.
Um, I don't, it's more like a type of town. And I think what I write about suburbs. I grew up in a suburb. I live in a suburb now. It's the world that I know. But it was actually interesting. Like somebody recently in a review said, Perrotta writes about wealthy suburbs. And I actually don't think that's completely true. Like one of the important things in Green Meadow is that the president of the school board is this hometown guy who went to California, made a fortune on this virtual pet app. And he's come back to town with all his money to kind of throw his weight around, but also he thinks to change it for the better. And he built this kind of stunning modernist monstrosity of a mansion. And it's surrounded by kind of humble, single family New Jersey suburb homes. So they're not McMansions. This is like kind of a middle class suburb. And I think part of the reason is I'm always trying to write a kind of this suburb is a distinct place, but it's also a kind of metaphor for America, and so that there was a kind of slightly grotesque inequality in this town seemed like very important, because I think when I grew up in Garwood, and if you drive through there, you'll see the houses are pretty much on par. Like it's a town. There weren't rich people. The rich people moved somewhere else. The lots were small, and the homes are still relatively small. So I guess I was imagining a town like that to some degree. But yeah, so I wouldn't say it's a wealthy suburb or an especially sort of bougie or hip kind of suburb. It's really like a middle of the middle.
It was so familiar to me. It sort of hit the same nerve that I felt when I was watching The Sopranos, that, this sort of like Nutley, Bloomfield, North Caldwell vibe, where there's just this huge mix of humanity. And I really loved how the president of the school board, to me, the mark of his having arrived was that he built the hot tub on his roof. I just thought that was such a wonderful detail. And I say this as a native, like I felt like that was a particularly Jersey form of aspiration to put the hot tub on the roof. I can only dream myself.
I'm right there with you.
Someday, Tom.
I know my roof won't sustain it.
If it does really well, you might have the hot tub on your roof.
That's right. Big party for everybody.
Tell me, it's funny, I don't think of it as a sequel. I read Election so long ago that I did not remember very much about it when I picked up Tracy Flick Can't Win. So if anyone's watching right now and hasn't read Election, go ahead and pick up this book, and you'll want to go back and read Election. But I too agree with this. Obviously you're the author, so you know best, but it reads as a companion. It's not you don't have to go into it knowing Tracy incredibly well. You will get to know.
And Tracy tells you kind of everything you need to know about what happened in the earlier book. And that was actually, an interesting question for me as the writer. How does Tracy talk about this event? Basically what happened when she was in high school, her civics teacher, who was the advisor to the student government, found her so annoying and threatening for various reasons that he not only recruited another candidate to run against her, but actually tried to steal the election from her. And she talks about that in this book, and I think she does it with it looms less large than you might think if you heard that it was a sequel. It's like she's had a whole life since then. This weird thing happened to her, and it is haunting her a little bit because she's trying to become principal of her high school. The principal has retired. She's the assistant principal. She thinks the job should be hers. And so she finds herself in that same position she found herself in high school. Like, here's this job. I am by far the most qualified person and the overwhelming favorite. There's no reason why I should not be able to achieve this. And yet all these obstacles come in her path. But I think she is a middle-aged person. And so when she thinks of high school, it's just a little story. It's just a fragment of her life. It's not something that, really looms. Yeah, there's nothing that you need to know if you picked up Tracy Flick Can't Win that the book won't tell you.
How has your relationship with Tracy changed over the years? Like 5, 10, 15 years ago, when she popped into your head, what crossed your mind?
So I think what's really interesting was that when I wrote Election, I thought that I was writing a book about a teacher who betrays his own deepest values and destroys himself in the process. So Mr. M, the teacher, is a guy who wants to do right by his students. He believes in democracy. He believes in defending the weak against the strong. He thinks of himself as an ethical person. And yet something about Tracy gets under his skin so badly that he cheats and he gets caught, and his career is ended. And so I had that in mind. And then I had to create the student candidates. And I was really interested in this idea of a brother and sister running against each other, and that there was all kinds of secrets in there. That seemed like a juicy thing. And Tracy began just as she was just the favorite, and I started to write about, well, everybody knows Tracy should be the principal because she does everything. And, she just suddenly started to take on a life. But that said, if you read Election, Tracy is one of the ensemble. But if you watch that movie, Reese Witherspoon, really just infused her character with so much vibrant comic energy that she began to loom really large in the culture. And so I had this strange experience as a writer of watching this character I created kind of first become different because an actress, inhabited her with such amazing energy. And then the culture kind of took her on. They used her, Tracy Flick, to kind of describe Hillary Clinton or Sarah Palin or Kirsten Gillibrand or Elise Stefanik, any ambitious seeming woman politician. And early on, it was kind of, to call someone a Tracy Flick was to suggest that they were unpleasant, abrasive, in someone who deserved to be knocked down a peg. So it was became a bit of a sexist stereotype, which pained me some, because I hadn't meant it that way. Like I said, Mr. M destroys himself. Tracy doesn't destroy him. His fear of her, fear of this powerful young woman, is what undoes him. And so it was really about like male revulsion for powerful women, but then it got turned against Tracy. And then what happened was recently, as sort of a precursor to the Me Too moment, some critics started to rethink Tracy. And it's a real tribute to the fact that the movie had just stayed in the culture and Tracy had stayed in the culture. And there was this kind of, hey, wait a second, why is Tracy Flick the bad guy? She's a high school student who's just trying to be elected president. And I actually, I reread Election before I wrote Tracy Flick Can't Win. And it's true. It's like, all she does is she rips some posters and lies about it. It's hardly enough to qualify you as a great villain, but she would often be like on these lists on the internet of like great villains, just be like, why is Tracy a villain? So that was the one part of that question. And the other part, I think the more serious part and the one that gave me more pause as a writer was what happened when Me Too emerged, because in election, and Tracy deals with this directly in Tracy Flick Can't Win. When she was 15, she had a relationship with her English teacher. It was very brief, and she ended it, but he was unable to hear that she wanted to break up, and he kept pestering her, and her mother found out, and he was fired. But she's very adamant in election that, I did this because I wanted to do it. I ended it because I wanted to end it, and I'm not a victim. She was just very clear about that. And then when Me Too emerged, I started to see a lot of women who had that very experience talk about it. And there was a variety of ways of talking about it. Some were felt very victimized by the teacher. Others who had been in Tracy's position back then were more ambivalent. They were, at the time, it seemed like something I wanted, but now as an adult, I wonder how I thought that way. And I know that it wasn't right in a way that wasn't clear to me then. And so I just wanted, as a writer, to feel like I had done justice to Tracy's perspective on that, because I understood why she didn't want to be a victim then. She was somebody who had real ambition in the world. And, she wanted to go into politics. She wanted to get a college scholarship. She wanted an empowering narrative. She needed one to achieve to believe in herself. And so the idea that she just saw no use in seeing herself as a victim, because that just put her in her own mind at a kind of a disadvantage. But now she's older and, starting to question her narrative.
I think you meet her the first time at this moment when teenagers, and I can really only mostly speak for, young women, because that's my area of expertise, but have this incredible power and are learning to harness it. And that energy that I think that people have seen in Tracy and been critical of, to me, was just that she was so full of potential and so green and hadn't yet learned how to target all of this energy. And then you see her in Tracy Flick Can't Win. And it's a little bit like that feeling you have when you go to a high school reunion and you realize that this person that you've seen in your mind's eye for decades has evolved just like you have. And your heart suddenly opens up and you're, happy to see them as they really are. When did she come to you and say, and, speaking dramatically, but like, was there a moment where you thought, I'm not done with this story?
I like the way you put it, because it does feel like she did come to me, and in a surprising way, which was that when I started to write this story, I thought it was a novel about Vito Falcone, and I should just stop for a moment and say Vito Falcone is a part of this novel. He is an alum of Green Meadow High School, where Tracy is the assistant principal. He was a great football hero in high school. He was a star in college, and he played 3 seasons in the NFL. So he's the one guy in this town who played professional football. He's now in his 40s, and he's a high school football coach, and he's made a mess of his life in many ways. He's in recovery, but he also is starting to suspect that he has a traumatic brain injury. And he's having all kinds of neurological symptoms that are scaring him. And so he's this former golden boy who is kind of falling apart. And I imagined that he was going to come back to his high school to be honored, be inducted into a Hall of Fame. So I thought the novel was going to be called Hall of Fame, and it was going to be about this broken down football player who comes home and has to reckon with the various people he hurt when he was younger. because it seemed like such a rich story about like where, you know, masculinity is right now in the culture. This sense that like, you know, yeah, we had our glory days, we men, and now, you know, now there's a reckoning that's being demanded. And so that was where I started. And as I did just a few days writing, and I was like, I was writing the book the way I wrote Election, which was in a series of short chapters that kind of mimic oral history, where you know, one narrator tells a little fragment of the story and another narrator tells another fragment of the story. And you know, I didn't understand why I was doing that, because it's not a usual structure for a novel. It's an unusual structure, and I had already done it in this other book, and I thought it doesn't seem right. You know, this book should find its own form. You know, that's one thing novelists know. Like, you have to play around a little bit to see, is this going to be a first person novel? Is it going to be a third person? Whose points of view am I going to tell it from? And so it's very troubled, because some part of me was absolutely certain that I had to use this short chapter form that I had used in Election. But it really bugged me. It didn't seem like a good idea, but I couldn't find another approach. And at some point I did say to myself, is it because Tracy is here? You know, I just started to sense like, oh, maybe that's what happened. And then suddenly she was there with her hand in the air saying like, please put me in, because I think the reason is Vito is the guy that she's been struggling against all her life. This, you know, male who has the sort of just male privilege in spades, right? He's good looking. He's a great athlete. He's super confident. You know, everybody, quote unquote, loves him, despite the fact that he's not a very lovable person. And in fact, when Tracy first hears of him, she just says, oh, I know that guy. You know, she's been fighting him all her life. And suddenly the book had two centers of gravity. And I think that's really important in a novel, you know, that you have two centers of gravity. And it's interesting because sometimes if you do that, then, you know, there's a kind of dialogue between those characters. But what's interesting in Tracy Flick Can't Win is they're on parallel tracks until quite late in the novel. But it actually solved a problem for me, because people would often say, well, what's Tracy doing? You know, and I have a friend who's like, oh, she'd be like Kaylee McEnany, or she'd be one of those. Yeah, I know. Or she'd be a blonde on Fox News. Like, yeah. No. And that's what I would say. I would say, no, I don't think so. And when I saw her in this high school and thought, oh God, she's an assistant principal, it was like, suddenly she was there. It was just that one of those things, you know, you've written novels. And so, you know, it's, you know, your subconscious is sometimes doing work for you, and you just have to somehow be able to listen to it. And for me, that's always a scary moment, because I feel like I haven't made a choice. I've just recognized something, and then you know, I hesitate for a bit, but I have done it long enough to learn to try and trust that if the book is sort of telling you what it wants to be, that's an important part of the process.
I will admit to you, I'm always reading a couple books at once. And I happened to be reading your book at the same time as I was reading Kellyanne Conway's memoir. I won't get into the backstory on that, but there were some similarities, I will say, between Tracy Flick and Kellyanne, but then their paths diverged in some very significant ways that made this book, your book, preferable to me. It did make me wonder what year it was when you started writing the book, in relation especially to the 2016 election. Because what happens in this book is really a microcosm of what happened in our country.
Yeah, so I can date it very clearly. The pandemic started in March of 2020, correct? It was. I started this in December of 2019, okay, and which was a real godsend for me during that period, because I think if I hadn't, it was just to have a book underway during that like scary destabilizing time when you couldn't leave the house and you really didn't understand yet what was happening. And so I just holed up for that whole winter and just, and then the following year and just really, lived with this book. And it was, I've never been so grateful for my work as I was then, because it was just something to, to hang on to. But it was definitely in conversation with the overwhelming, political tension of those days. And so, yes, I do like the idea of a microcosm. Interestingly, Tracy doesn't mention Trump. She mentions Mike Pence.
Well, she is the vice principal.
Yeah, she's very interested in people in the number 2 position.
I spent the pandemic knitting ugly blankets that nobody wants. And I think, why didn't I just do something productive that would be, why didn't I start some big writing project? But instead I just became this sad crafter. So good for you for spending your time.
Unlike me, you have a full-time job. It's very demanding.
I have plenty of time to read and write. Tom, speaking of, you mentioned kind of the cultural moment, time we're in, there's a lot of conversation happening about who is entitled to write what character and from what perspective. How have you gotten pushback from people who say, who are you to write a 41 or 42-year-old woman? And what are your thoughts on that?
I haven't, and sometimes it's such an interesting thing. I mean, maybe I got grandfathered in. I wrote Tracy a long time ago, but I've been writing women characters and putting them at the center of my novels for a long time. Mrs. Fletcher, Little Children, Abstinence Teacher, and all I can say here, I can say 2 things. My first books, Bad Haircut and The Wishbones, were very much like guy books. Bad Haircut was all about male friendship, and The Wishbones were about a group of guys in a wedding band. And there were women in the stories, but they were not point of view characters. And it seemed to me that was limiting, to just be writing about men and their experience. And I as a writer, I thought, I want to write something bigger. And to do that, I need to write about, a more diverse spectrum of characters. And then, first, order of that was to write believable women. When I wrote Election, that was the first book that had major female characters for me. And that was Tracy, and that was Tammy, who was the sort of the Ross Perot in the high school election. She was the one who's just saying, let's just dismantle the student government. It's completely useless, and she was voicing a kind of populism that was, seemed more comic in those days and less scary. But I was actually more scared about writing Tammy because she was a lesbian character. And that was, so I felt like a double challenge. But I did it, I wrote Election. I had these 6 narrators, 3 were women and 3 were men. And, far from having any pushback at that point, I had the actually wonderful experience as a writer of having a lot of women come up to me and say, I was a Tracy Flick. And they felt like the book had, that Tracy in particular had reminded them of themselves and had given them a way to kind of identify themselves. Because I do think, in that time, in the 80s and 90s, this is the first generation of American girls who've been raised with the idea, you can do anything. I was just reading a biography of Sylvia Plath, who's an amazing figure. Yeah, wonderful. And
so good. I recommend it to everyone.
yeah, but even there it was like this is in the 50s. She had to scrape for everything. You know, she's just Mrs. Ted Hughes, you know. She's like possibly the greatest poet of her generation, but she's Mrs. Ted Hughes. And you know, she's at her college graduation, and Adlai Stevenson is telling these, you know, women at Smith that they just need to, you know, get married and shut up, essentially. And so, you know, there's this feminist revolution in the 60s and 70s, and suddenly girls like Tracy are being raised by mothers who are telling them they can do anything, and they believe it. And what was the question that we started with? I lost my train because I got caught on.
I mean, you answered it. The question was sort of rhetorical, but are you allowed to write a woman?
Oh yes. So I feel like this is why people were actually grateful for this character, because they felt when you know, men watched Election and said Tracy's so scary, but women who watched it just said, oh, I was that girl. I had my hand in the air. I joined every club, and they were remembering themselves with the kind of fondness, as you say, that we remember our youthful selves. You know, a lot of these women were not, you know, senators and judges. They were, you know, they were teachers, or that, you know, they had office jobs, or they were stay-at-home moms, but they remembered having that ambition and being, you know, overeager, but also like intensely interested in succeeding. And they were allowed, you know, they thought they were allowed to do it. And then suddenly they ran into a lot of men who didn't necessarily want to be competing with them.
Also, it's not enough to just have your mom tell you over and over, you can do anything, and to learn all the words to Free to Be You and Me. The world has to change in such a way that the structure exists, you know, for that to work out for both sexes, I think.
Right. And
that's a larger conversation, but
it is.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's so interesting about this character, because I think she does intersect with a lot of, you know, through lines in our culture. You know, we were talking about it before. I think, you know, Tracy comes off as abrasive sometimes because nobody knew what a female political leader was supposed to look like or sound like, and we're still trying to figure that out as a culture.
Right.
And you know, that idea that somebody's abrasive or unlikable, and that somehow in a woman that's a real shortcoming. But you know, nobody ever stopped and said, "Boy, that Mitch McConnell, you know, he needs to
really
be
shrill."
Yeah.
Nobody says he's shrill or pushy or yeah.
And he's got to get rid of that baggy suit.
Nobody does, but maybe they should. Tom, what kind of research did you do for Tracy Flick? I just imagined well, I guess you were writing it during the pandemic, so you weren't strolling the halls of the high school and smelling the cafeteria and visiting the principal's office?
No, you know, so it is interesting how the internet has changed research for novelists. Like in the past, I would always make sure I did at least one research trip. And this time I didn't, but what I found was like, okay, Tracy is applying to be a principal. And it just turns out, if you want to know, there are websites for people who are applying to be principals, and there are always people who, you know, are dispensing advice, and they're saying like, here's how the process goes, and here's what you should do at all these steps. And it was very eye-opening for me. You know, I would have had to find a principal and you know, and you find one person, you can get their singular quirky experience, but this, you know, online you could find like many people talking about their experiences and giving advice. And it was like, okay, that's how this will happen. This was not a research heavy book. Like I had to do some checking about things like traumatic brain injuries. You know, I went to high school a long time ago, but my kids are in their 20s. And so they went to high school not so long ago. And I got to re-experience high school through their eyes and hear about their experiences. I did, you know, and we haven't talked much about the Hall of Fame, which is at the heart of this story, but one of the people who is a candidate for the Hall of Fame is a young woman who is an ASMR artist. She does that.
Oh, I thought that was so great. I am fascinated by ASMR. My kids are so into it. I don't get it.
I don't get it either, but I wanted to talk about the difference between Tracy's idea of fame, which is like real world political fame or academic fame, and this sort of virtual fame that now is a huge force in our culture. And so I thought, okay, there's a girl from this town, and she isn't, she's not a YouTube superstar, but she's one of those people who is starting to get an income stream from YouTube. And she does a combination of, makeup videos and ASMR, which is this sort of whispery, there's a whole thing. So I had to, do a deep dive on that. And it's just so fascinating, when you just learn about some corner of the world. Like, for some people it's not some obscure corner of the world. It's it's something they watch all the time. But for me, it was like, I just, I'm suddenly like listening to somebody explain how to put on makeup in this whispery voice, and they're tapping their fingers and scratching things, and just it's a little bit, the only thing weirder for me is like people who get famous for taking things out of boxes.
Yes, that it's all of a piece. I have a 15-year-old daughter who's like practically has a PhD in all of those things. There's something new every day. I don't understand any of it. But like the sound of people's mouth, like the saliva in their mouth, it's disgusting. Yeah, it's very, you could make a fortune off it.
Well,
and it would be easier than writing novels.
I think I missed that boat, but I do think there's something about it that mimics intimacy. I felt myself leaning in toward the screen, and somebody's whispering to you, and it is like there's something intensely intimate about that, and it does something in your brain, and I mean, in that sense, it's, I think, related to porn as well, where you're able to jump past getting to know someone and pretend that there's some intimate connection.
Right. I know that I'm about to start taking some questions, but people always ask this question in events like this, so I'm going to just head it off at the pass. What were you reading, listening to, and even maybe eating as a snack while you were working on this book?
So here's this is not a guilty pleasure, but my writing day would happen. It's usually for me like 10 to 2, 9 to 1. It's like I have about 4 good hours in me. And one of the other benefits of the pandemic was then I would always just exercise, because again, there was nothing else to do. And then we would make dinner. My wife and I are huge audiobook listeners. And like a lot of audiobook listeners, we like, among other things, we like crime novels. And there's a series of novels from the 60s and 70s, the Parker novels by Richard Stark, who was a pen name for Donald Westlake. It's about it's always about a heist, and this guy Parker gets a group of thieves together. I recommend them for anybody who likes good writing. They are so taut. And it really was, I will say, like Tracy Flick Can't Win is a very taut book. Like you can read it very quickly. And I'm not one of those people who, thinks that just because a book is like dense and difficult, it's better than a book that's, kind of spare and forceful. But I really was, using Stark's writing as a kind of inspiration for like you feel like there are no words between you and the story. Somehow, like you're reading these words, and sometimes they're beautifully turned sentences, but most of the time it's as if the words are disappearing and you're kind of having direct access to story. And that was just as a kind of a narrative ideal. That was something that was in my mind when I was writing this book.
I have to ask as an aside, are you listening to Red Comet or are you reading it?
I read Red Comet.
Wow. Because I listened to all 44 hours of it.
Oh, wow.
And I highly recommend it. If anyone who's listening, Red Comet by Heather Clark. It is a 1,000-page biography of Sylvia Plath, who in her own way is a precursor to Tracy Flick. I'm glad you brought her up, because when I mentioned Red Comet in a conversation at the New York Times Book Review about the best books of 2021, people were sort of daunted by the 1,000 pages. And I definitely said she was like Tracy Flick. She was ahead of her time, give her a chance, and everyone fell for it.
Yeah, no,
anyway,
it's an amazing book. I second you on that.
It's amazing, but let's talk about your book. Did you, one thing I wanted to ask is, I believe there are eight points of view altogether. Am I right?
There are 5 people on the Hall of Fame committee. Yes,
Okay.
eight points of view. There's Vito, there's Front Desk Diane, and there's Glenn.
I love Front Desk Diane. She's such a great character. Did you write the points of view? Did you write it chronologically, or did you write the separate points of view and then kind of weave them together?
I write it chronologically. It's almost like a relay race where the story is getting handed off. And you know, I think what's interesting about that is that the cuts can be very strange, right? Because sometimes one character is actually commenting on, you know, the account that another character just gave. Other times someone else is just in a complete other mental space. You know, they're supposed to be at this meeting talking about something important, but their mind is on something else entirely. But I think the whole book was written more or less chronologically. But when I was done and handed it into my editor, she noticed, I mean, I had started with Vito, and she just said, you know, this really, you want to call this book Tracy Flick Can't Win, you really should start with Tracy. And she had this other criticism of that draft, which was that Tracy talked about her high school experience with the teacher very late in the novel, and it felt very abrupt to her. But I hadn't been able to address it directly. But then when I was responding to that note of, you know, maybe let's find a way to begin the story with Tracy, I then, you know, was able to write very directly about, you know, her reading a story in the paper about a teacher who had multiple affairs with students and the students' accounts. And I think it's a very different book as a result of that. And that's happened to me a couple of times where there was something really crucial that I couldn't write chronologically. I had to get all the way to the end before I understood about this empty space that needed to be filled.
How do you know who to cut to next, who to pass the ball to? Is that something you outline ahead of time, or do you just arrive at a point where you know Vito is going to pick up the story from there, say?
Yeah, that is it's a very intuitive process for me. And I remember when I was in grad school and just started to get a sense of the power of a cut in a short story or a novel, and you know, just those lines of white space and what happens when you break one section and start another. I will say it's a part of writing that I really love, and that I feel like I intuitively understand. Like I'm, you know, I understand. Like there's some things, we all know this. Yeah, we have some strengths as writers and some weaknesses. Like you know, there are a lot of writers who write better sentences than I do, but I feel like I am very strong in terms of like knowing what to do with a cut and you know, where to go from one section to another. So that's one of those things that don't have to think There's a lot of things I stay up at night sweating over and I can't figure out, but that's not one of them.
One of the things I love to do when I'm reviewing a book that's written from multiple perspectives is to imagine if the person's name wasn't printed at the top of the chapter opener, would I know who that voice was? And I think even though you have so many voices in this book, you could open it up on any page and not need any signposts to tell you who's, who you're in the hands of, which to me is the mark of a successful multi-narrative story.
Oh, and that's great because it's really coming from character, not even from voice. Like the voices aren't, I don't use like most of the time, turns of phrase or it's really just, it's what the person is noticing, what their emotions are, it's that is, I'm really happy to hear that. I will also say, I don't have patience for novelists who don't identify their characters.
Neither do I.
It's such I don't want to be lost in a narrative. I don't think that that particular game that like modernists play is ultimately something that bore fruit. It's
that's like
it's
the writers
wasted
who
work.
decide, that's like the writers who decide not to use quotation marks for dialogue. Like, come on, I'm old school. I need it. Also, I don't want the family tree at the front of the book. If you have to show me the family tree, your family's too confusing. I'm taking a look at the chat to see what questions people have for us. Oh, here's a good one. Do you feel this well, I won't read people's names in case they want to remain anonymous, but thanks to everyone who has put a question in the chat. Do you feel that the same Tom who wrote Election wrote this book? If not, what do you feel your life experience has added to the perspective on the main character and the setting?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So it's a very philosophical question. So I started to write Election in 1993, so that is almost 30 years ago. In those 30 years, I've gotten older, but I also have had kids, which I think has changed me. I've also lost a parent. I've just had 30 years of experience. So that's me personally. I think I know different things. I probably would not have looked at the secretary of the school, front desk Diane, and 30 years ago. I think if the school secretary is mentioned in Election, it's sort of as a joke. It's almost like that kid thing of like, there's something funny about adults who work in high school. But I think like front desk Diane, my heart kind of went out to her, and that I wasn't that person 30 years ago. Maybe I was a compassionate person, I hope, but I just didn't see certain people when I was younger. So that like you change that way. And then I think to what extent, the culture changes us in 30 years. I think, Jack Weed, the principal, is talking about his raffish younger days as a teacher. And he says, we're all prisoners of our historical context. And anybody who thinks that morality doesn't change over time, well, they just haven't lived long enough, So the culture has changed. And in some ways, we either change with it or we don't. I remember, just going to college and telling people like, oh, there were no gay people in my high school, because it was not a friendly place for gay people, and everyone was, kept very quiet about it. And, and then I suddenly, go back to reunions like, oh, there there were gay people in my high school. You know, I mean, that doesn't mean I've changed exactly, but my sense of, you know, the spectrum of humanity has definitely expanded over these past 30 years. And my, you know, willingness to question my former beliefs, you know, certainly like a lot of America.
Yeah.
You know, I grew up in a different world.
One thing that we didn't touch on, and this isn't, I don't think, giving too much away, but Tracy's trajectory of her plan for herself is derailed by her decision to take care of her mother who has MS. And I would say, for myself at least, I'm not, I hope, putting words in your mouth, but I think when you're, you know, 30 years ago, I would never imagine that somebody with the ambitions of Tracy Flick would sideline herself in order to take care of her mother. And then, of course, you arrive at a point in middle age. I too have a mother who lives in the house that I grew up in, and you know, you just realize your perspective changes on caretaking in all aspects of life.
Yeah, and you know, when I went back and read Election, I think I was so, you know, again, like you read a book that you read when you were, you know, 30 years ago, it's an entirely different book, right? And things jump out at you. I mean, I wrote Election, so I wrote about Tracy's relationship with her mother, but it loomed so large to me rereading it. I realized she was such a lonely person, and she was, in a sense, who she was because her mother had told her to be that person. So they had this kind of, you know, all knotted up. Their relationship was all knotted up. Like Tracy wanted what she wanted because her mother told her to want it and rewarded her for getting it. And, you know, in some ways, Tracy could resent her mother. But I think because she was lonely and because no one ever took that place as the most important other person in her life, that was her experience of love, you know. And when her mother got sick, she did not want to give up her life. And I think, you know, I tried in that chapter where I talk about that to just say she didn't know that that's what she was doing. It was just sort of a day-to-day, week-to-week thing. And then suddenly, you know, it's that idea of like you take one step off the path and then suddenly you're really far away after, you know, an hour of walking. It's right. Like, so, and you know, I think you know, we all have seen people who, you know, people you go to, you know, when you're younger and you see what happens to people in their 20s. Like sometimes life just intervenes in ways that make it really hard for them to do the thing that they wanted to do. And Tracy's one of those people, and you think she'd be too strong, but she had nothing to fall back on. Either she left her mother to suffer, and there are people who do this, right? Who are just like, I got my own thing to do. But it was, you know, that's also, I think women are much more likely to feel that caretaking obligation is something they have to take seriously.
Tom, I'm going to hit you with one or two more questions. This is a big one. Approach it as you will. Can you talk about converting The Leftovers to TV? In a nutshell.
Yeah, no, well, I will say that I love The Leftovers TV show so much. And I think one of the reasons I love it so much is that it became something that I never could have imagined. And, you know, I have Damon Lindelof to thank for it. He's the showrunner, the guy who did Lost and Watchmen. He's just a brilliant TV writer. And, you know, we had to learn to collaborate together. I was in the writer's room in that show, and I wrote a number of scripts with Damon. And the first year, you know, I was very much like a defensive novelist saying, like, you know, let's adapt my book. And he kept wanting to bring these other elements, these sort of more sci-fi, mythological, shamanistic elements into it. And, you know, at first I resisted, and then I started to see that he could actually make it work. And we had a room full of great writers, including Patrick Somerville, who just did Station 11. There are a lot of great writers there, and so part of that experience for me was like just letting go of the idea that I had the singular vision for what The Leftovers was, and that was an amazing thing to be in a room and have other people telling me, here's what the story can be, and I was almost like a spectator at times going like, oh, that is amazing. let's do that. So it was kind of a transformative process. It was not easy, as anyone who's ever played in a rock band or done anything collaborative knows. I mean, there's a level of struggle and you win one and you lose one to that process. But by the end, we were in a very sort of trusting and collaborative place.
Have you heard from, because she made Tracy Flick such an iconic, well, you made Tracy Flick an iconic character, but Reese Witherspoon then took her to the next level. Have you heard from Reese about your new book, and does she have plans to return to Tracy?
Well, I know she likes the book. I sent it to her early on because I felt like, even when I was writing it, I could hear Reese's Tracy in my head. I think she just did something that's so memorable. It's hard to imagine what Tracy was before that.
Right.
So I felt like she was, a collaborator. She was also responsible for Tracy, I think, remaining alive and in the culture for all these years. So, and she, she really I'll let her speak for herself at some point when she chooses, but she liked the book a lot. And I think there's a lot of interest in making a film. It's in the Hollywood negotiating phase.
Yes. Well, good luck with that.
No,
we haven't talked much about your writing process, which I know from experience can be a sort of excruciating line of conversation. But I'm just going to ask you one question, and I think this is a nice place to end. I always assume that people who come to watch novelists speak about their books are, of course, readers, but sometimes, writers themselves toiling away on something that they don't know, they don't know where it's going, or they don't know if they'll have the guts to see it through. What advice, not just plain old writing advice, but I guess really what inspiration do you have for somebody who's watching you right now and thinking, I think I can, but I'm not sure.
We could spend a whole hour on this particular subject, because I've been doing this for 30 some years, and this is my 10th book. So you'll hear this from any number of writers. You would think it would get easier. It doesn't. There's something about the novel that is a kind of a marathon. It's very grueling. So I think there is some kind of quality of stubbornness and patience and resilience. And I would say like self-forgiveness. I really recommend self-forgiveness to people because, it's going to be a painful process. It can also be an ecstatic process, but often you have to really struggle for your ecstasy. It's very kind of a Protestant work ethic kind of an art. This is why I love music so much. I love the idea that the actual practicing of the art is the art, and that there's something spontaneous and joyful about it, because that is often not the experience of writing a novel. And so to make it into a kind of a discipline. So it's not even a question whether I'm going to be at my desk, and whether that is for, people have jobs and it's just 1 hour a day or something. But if you just say, I'm going to be at my desk, and the struggle isn't about that, but just about what am I going to write today, that's a win. And boy, I don't know, I wrote 3 books before I got one published, and that was a very painful part of my life. And when I look back, I think I must have had this very, like Tracy, this very strong belief in myself, and I understood why other people thought I was full of it, but I just had this sense of like, I have to do this, and if it didn't work this time, I have to work harder the next time.
Yeah.
And it's like those are not necessarily like you want to hear from your artists that they are, in some way like spiritual people or imaginative, creative people. But I actually think that there's this other more workaday sense of just pushing forward and patiently accumulating the words that is really the day-to-day reality for me as a novelist.
I love that. I think that's much more fulfilling advice than the writers who say it just poured out of me, it just came to me. I can't. That's
yeah.
I don't buy that. I like your approach is also very Jersey. Just nose to the grindstone, get it done.
Yeah, and every now and then there's a moment of grace where like something happens, and you're like, oh, that was a gift from whoever dispenses those gifts.
Absolutely. It's like when you reach a little break in the parkway and you catch a glimpse of the skyline. It's like a miracle. Tom, this has been so much fun. I'm going to invite Ariel to come back and see us out, but this has been a huge treat. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liz. I really enjoyed it.
This was fun.
Tom and Liz, thank you both so much for coming to Open Book, Open Mind tonight for this delightful and illuminating discussion. As someone who always, grew up thinking that I identify with the Tracy Flicks of the world, what can I say? And I want to thank everybody who tuned in tonight, because without you, we're nothing, as I always say. And I just want to remind everybody that although the library gives it away, novelists need to eat too. And the most sincere compliment you can pay an author is to consider buying their work. So we're going to have links in the chat to borrow or to buy Tracy Flick Can't Win. It's available for sale by our partner, Watch on Booksellers, and is also available to borrow through the library. And we invite you to stay tuned in the coming months for more information about Open Book, Open Mind's fall season. So be well, and we hope to see you soon. Have a great summer.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.